The Afghan government, having secured a treaty in December 1978 that allowed for them to call on Soviet forces, repeatedly requested the introductions of troops into Afghanistan in the spring and in the summer of 1979. They requested Soviet troops to provide security and to assist in the fight against the Mujahideen and their rebels. After the killing of Soviet technicians in Herat by rioting mobs, the Soviet government sold Mi-24 helicopters to the Afghan military and increased the number of military advisors in the country to 3,000. On the 14th of April 1979, the Afghan government requested that the USSR send between 15 to 20 helicopters, along with their crews, to Afghanistan. And on the 16th of June, the Soviet government responded and sent a detachment of tanks, BPMs, and crews to guard the government in Kabul and to secure the Bagram and the Shanadaya airfield. In response to this request, an airborne battalion commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Lumakin arrived at the Bagram Air Base on the 7th of July. They arrived without their combat gear, disguised as technical specialists. They were the personal bodyguards for President Nur Muhammad Taraki and Taraki Habibullah Amin. The paratroopers were directly subordinate to the senior Soviet military advisor and did not interfere with Afghan politics. Several leading politicians at the time, such as Alexander Kosygin and Andrei Gromyko, were against this intervention. So after a month, the Afghan request was no longer for the individual crews and even subunits, but for regiments and even larger size battalions. Wink wink. In July, the Afghan government requested that 2 motorized rifle divisions be sent to Afghanistan. The following day, they requested an airborne division in addition to an earlier request, which was the Muslim battalion. They repeated these requests, and even in variations and variants of these requests, over the following months right up to December 1979. However, the Soviet government was in no hurry to grant these requests. Based on information from the KGB, Soviet leaders felt that Prime Minister Habibullah Amin's actions had destabilized the situation in Afghanistan. Following his initial coup against the killing of President Nur Muhammad Taraki, the KGB station in Kabul warned Moscow that Amin's leadership would lead to harsh repression and result in the activation and the consolidation of the opposition. The Soviets then established a secret commission and a special commission on Afghanistan. Comprising of the KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, chairman of the Central Committee Boris Ponomarev, and the Minister of Defense Dmitry Yunstinov. Right. In late April 1978, the committee reported that Amin was purging his opponents, from the Khalqs to the Mujahideen to even Soviet loyalists, and that his loyalty to Moscow was in question, and that he was seeking diplomatic links with even Pakistan and possibly the People's Republic of China, which at the time had poor relations with the Soviet Union, which is the Sino-Soviet split, which I might touch on to give context to why the Maoists and the Mujahideen were funded by China. Anyway, of specific concern was Pakistan, because Pakistan was actually aligned with the United States of America, their Cold War enemy. And Amin was secretly in a meeting with the US Change Their Affairs, J. Bruce Armstrong, which never really amounted to anything or any agreement between Amin and the United States, but it still sowed suspicion in the Kremlin nonetheless. Information obtained from the KGB from its agents in Kabul proved to be the last arguments for eliminating Amin and his government in Kabul. Supposedly, 2 of Amin's bodyguards had killed the former president Nur Muhammad Taraki with a pillow. Shh, night night. And Amin himself was suspected as a CIA agent. The latter, however, is still disputed, with Amin's repeatedly demonstrating the friendliness towards the various delegations of the Soviet Union who would arrive in Afghanistan. But as a wise man once said, to play the part, you gotta act the part. The Soviet general Vasily Zapolatin, a political advisor to the premier of Brezhnev at the time, claimed that 4 of the President Taraki's ministers were responsible for the destabilization. However, Zapatalin failed to emphasize this discussion and was not really heard over the war dogs in the Kremlin. And by war dogs, I mean, oh, we're going to install a new government and come back home in like 2 weeks. During meetings between President Taraki and Soviet leadership in March 1979, the Soviets promised political support and to send military equipment and even technical specialists, but upon repeated requests by Taraki for direct military Soviet intervention, the leadership adamantly opposed Taraki. The reasons included that they would be met with bitter resentment from the Afghan people, that the intervention was to be in another country's civil war would have a propaganda victory for their opponents, mostly the United States, and Afghanistan's overall inconsequential weight to the international affairs, in essence realizing they had little to gain by taking over a country with a poor economy, unstable government, and a population hostile to outsiders since the beginning of time. It was nothing worth it. What? Oil in Afghanistan? Okay. However, as the situation continued to deteriorate from May to December 1979, Moscow changed its mind on dispatching Soviet troops into Afghanistan. The reasons for this complete turnabout and 180 was not really entirely clear, and several speculations and speculative arguments would include the grave internal situation and the inability of the Afghan government and military, the effects of the Iranian Revolution that brought a Islamic theocracy into power next door, leading to fears that the religious fanaticism would spread through Afghanistan and then into the Soviet Muslim Central Asian republics and even into the Caucasus. Taraki's murder and replacement by Amin, the Soviets also feared that they could become aligned with the Americans and even provide them with a new strategic position after the loss of Iran, and with the Iran-Iraq war going on, it was a perfect cover to invade Afghanistan. And the deteriorations of the ties with the United States after the NATO two-track missile deployment decision and the failure of Congress to ratify SALT II, creating the impression that détente was already effectively dead. The British journalist Patrick Borgen wrote in 1989, Travel to the Future, what? The simplest explanation is probably the best. They got stuck into Afghanistan as much as the United States got stuck into Vietnam, without clearly thinking through the consequences and widely underestimating the hostility they would arouse. The Amin regime was collapsing in on itself, with morale in the Afghan army having fallen to rock bottom levels since 1978. While the Mujahideen, those engaged in jihad or those engaged in holy war, had taken control of most of the countryside and even some industrial complexes. The general consensus among the Afghan experts at the time was not like a question of if the Mujahideen would take Kabul, but when the Mujahideen would take Kabul. In Moscow, Leonid Brezhnev was also indecisive and waffled as he usually did when faced with a difficult decision. The three decision makers in Moscow who pressed the hardest for an invasion in the fall of 1979 were the Troika, or the Troika, or the Three, or the Big Three in the Kremlin, consisting of the Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, the chairman of the KGB Yuri Andropov, and the Defense Minister Marshal Dmitry Yunstinov. The principal reasons for the invasion was the belief in Moscow that Amin was a leader that was both incompetent and a fanatical leader, who had lost all control of the situation, together with the belief that the United States, via Pakistan, and Pakistan as well, who were sponsoring and supplying the Islamic insurgents into Afghanistan. Andropov, Gromyko, and Yunstinov all agreed that the radical Islamic regime, if it came to power in Kabul, would attempt to sponsor radical Islamists in the Soviet Central Republics and of course in the Caucasus with the Chechens, thereby requiring a punitive and a preemptive strike. thereby requiring a preemptive strike on Afghanistan. What they were envisioning was the fall of 1979 would be a short invasion under which Moscow would replace the radical Khalq faction and the communists headed by Taraki Habibullah Amin, with the moderate Parcham faction under Barak Komal to stabilize the situation, keep a couple of troops there for a couple of months, and then head back to Uzbekistan. The concerns raised by the chief of the Red Army General Staff, Marshal Nikolai Udgarkov, who warned about the possibility of a protracted guerrilla war, much like in Vietnam, were dismissed by the Troika, or the Three, who insisted that any occupation of Afghanistan would be short and relatively painless and even peaceful. Most notably though, the diplomats in Norkomandel of the embassy in Kabul and the KGB officers who were stationed in Afghanistan were all informed about the developments of the nation more than the Troika were, but such information rarely filtered through to the decision makers in the Troika, who viewed Afghanistan more of a context of the Cold War, rather than understanding Afghan as a subject in of its own right. The viewpoint was that the United States were fomenting the Islamic insurgency in Afghanistan with the aim of destabilizing Soviet Central Asia, tended to downplay the effects of the unpopular communist government, pursuing policies that the majority of the Afghans violently dislike and even oppose, as a generator for the insurgents, and strengthen those who agreed and actually argued some sort of Soviet response was required to what was seen as an outrageous American provocation. It was assumed in Moscow because of Pakistan, an ally of both the United States and China, was supporting the Mujahideen, and therefore was ultimately the United States and China who were behind the rebellion and the rebellious Afghanistan. On the 31st of October 1979, Soviet informants on the orders of the inner circle of the advisors under the Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev relayed information to the Afghan armed forces for them to undergo maintenance cycles for their tanks and other critical equipment. Meanwhile, telecommunication links in the area outside of Kabul were severed, isolating the capital. With the deteriorating security situation, large numbers of the Soviet airborne forces joined the station of the ground troops and began to land in Kabul on the 25th of December. Simultaneously, Amin moved the offices from the President Palace to the Presidential Tajbek Palace, believing this location was to be more secure from possible threats. Oh no. According to Colonel General Tokarenov, and Miloshkai, Amin was informed of the military maneuvers and movements, having requested Soviet military assistance in the northern Afghanistan provinces in December the 17th. On the 17th of December 1979. His brother and general, Dmitry Chingogov, met with the commander of the 40th Army before the Soviet troops entered the country to work out the initial route and locations for Soviet troops to be stationed. On the 27th of December 1979, the day that changed the world forever, for better or worse, 700 troops of the Soviet Union, dressed in Afghan clothes from the Muslim republics of the USSR, including the KGB and GRU Special Task Force officers from the Alpha Group and Zenith Group, occupied major governmental, military, and media buildings in Kabul, including their primary target, the Tajbek Palace. The operation began at 1900 when the KGB-led Soviet Zenith Group destroyed Kabul's communication hub, paralyzing the Afghan military command. At 1915, the assault of the Tajbek Palace began. As planned, President Habibullah Amin was killed. Simultaneously, other objectives were occupied, example like the Ministry of Interior at 915, the operations of 1920, and of course, the operation was fully successful and fully complete by the morning of the 28th of December 1979, Boxing Day, Eastern Orthodox style, yes. The Soviet military command of the Tarzem Uzbek Uz SSR announced to Radio Kabul that Afghanistan had been liberated from Amin's rule. According to the Soviet Politburo, they were complying with the 1978 Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Good Neighborliness, and that Amin had been executed by a tribunal for his war crimes and crimes against humanity. That committee then elected as head of the government former Deputy Prime Minister Barack Kemal, who had been demoted to a relatively insignificant post as ambassador to Czechoslovakia, following the cult takeover. And then, now that the Parcham had taken over, he announced that it was requested and that he requested Soviet military assistance and intervention. Soviet ground forces under the command of Marshal Sergei Sokolov entered Afghanistan from the north from the 27th of December 1979. In the morning of the 28th of December, the 100 Guards Vikskubich Airborne Division landed in the airport at Bagram, and deployment of Soviet troops into Afghanistan was on the way. The force then entered Afghanistan, and the additional 103rd Guard Airborne Division was now under the command of the 40th Army and consisted of the 108th, the 5th Guards Motor Rifle Division, the 8060 Separate Motor Rifle Regiment, the 56th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade, and the 36th Mixed Air Corps Brigade. Later, the 201st and the 68th Motor Rifle Division also entered the country, along with other smaller units. All in all, the initial Soviet forces were 1,800 tanks, 80,000 soldiers, 2,000 AFVs, or Armored Protective Vehicles, or Armored Fighter Vehicles, or like BTMs and stuff like that. In the second week alone, Soviet aircraft had made a total of 4,000 flights into Kabul, with the arrival of 2 later divisions, and of course Soviet bombings of rebel strongholds in the countryside. The total Soviet force rose to over 100,000 personnel by 1980, as it was a couple of days, so 1980, right? Foreign ministers from 34 Islamic nations, republics, and even kingdoms, and even Muslim-leaning nations like Indonesia, adopted a resolution which condemned the Soviet invasion, or the intervention, and demanded the immediate, the urgent, and the unconditional withdrawal of Soviet troops from the Muslim nations of Afghanistan. From the Muslim nation of Afghanistan, not the Muslim nations, my bad. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution protesting the Soviet intervention. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution protesting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, intervention, by a vote of 104 to 18. According to political scientist Gilles Kepler, the Soviet intervention or invasion was viewed with horror in the West, considered to be a fresh twist on the geopolitical great game of the 19th century, which Britain feared that Russia saw access to India and the Indian Ocean via Central Asia, and posed a threat to Western security, implying and even explicitly violating the world balance of power agreed at Yalta in 1945. Weapons supplied were made available through numerous countries. The United States purchased all of Israel's captured Soviet weapons that were clandestinely sent to Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, probably a few Uzis and Galils, because I got a lot of footage of that, right? And then funneled the weapons to the Mujahideen, while Egypt upgraded its army weapons and sent all the weapons to their militias. Turkey sold their World War II stockpiles to the warlords, and the British and Swiss provided the blowpipe missiles and the Orlikins anti-aircraft guns respectively, and some British Enfields that were purchased from India as well. We'll get into Britain later, but after they were found to be poor models for their own forces, and might as well test it and waste it in Afghanistan, right? China provided the most relevant weapons like the AK or the Type 56, the Trimco, which is a M16 copy, and the SKS-30 AK mags. We'll get into the weapons that China shipped over later, but China did provide the most relevant and up-to-date weapons, likely due to their own experience with guerrilla warfare, and kept meticulous records of all their shipments, to Afghanistan. The first phase, occupation. The first phase of the war began with the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and the first battle with various opposition groups. Soviet troops entered Afghanistan along 2 ground routes and 1 air corridor, quickly taking over control of most of the urban centers, military bases, and even strategic installations. However, the presence of Soviet troops did not have the desired effect on pacifying the country. On the contrary, like in Vietnam, it even exacerbated the nationalist sentiment, causing the rebellion to spread further, more viciously, and even more radically. Barack Kamal, Afghanistan's new first democratically elected president, charged the Soviets with causing an increase in the unrest and demanded that the 40th Army step in and quell the rebellions by themselves, as his own army had been proven untrustworthy and even incompetent, even those who were trained in the Soviet Union. Thus, the Soviet troops found themselves drawn into fighting against the urban uprisings, tribal armies called Isakars, and sometimes even against mutinying Afghan army units. These forces mostly fought in the open, and Soviet air power and artillery made short work of the Afghan military. And that is the first stage. The second stage is 80 to 85, which I will do tomorrow because this is already an hour long and it's already going on to 7 o'clock. I gotta get buff. Can't do videos forever, guys. So anyway, I can't really say hope you learn something because tomorrow we have to do it again. So enjoy. The war was now on, and the war now developed into a new pattern. The Soviets occupied the cities and the main axes of communication, while the Mujahideen, which the Soviet army soldiers called the dustmen, or enemy, or the rock speaks Fars, or the sand speaks Allahu Akbar, which meant enemy, divided into smaller groups and waged a guerrilla war. Almost 80% of the country was outside of the government's control. Soviet troops were deployed to strategic areas in the northeast, especially along the roads from Tazem to Kabul. In the west, a strong Soviet presence was maintained to counter Iranian influence. Incidentally, special Soviet units would have also performed secret attacks on Iranian territory to destroy suspected Mujahideen bases, and their helicopters even got engaged in shooting with Iranian jets. Yes, Iranian jets, you heard me right? And coincidentally, the Iran-Iraq war was going on, and as we said, the Soviets had an interesting relationship with Iraq, to say nonetheless. So could these attacks be helping the Iraqis as well? I guess that we'll never know. Conversely, some regions like Nuristan in the northeast and Harazat in the central mountains of Afghanistan were virtually untouched by the fighting and lived in a almost complete independence and quasi-peaceful nature till the end of the war and Taliban rule. But periodically, the Soviet army would undertake multi-divisional offensives into Mujahideen control areas. Between 1980 to 1985, 9 offensives were launched into the strategically important Panjshir Valley, or the Panjshir Valley. But the government control of this area did not improve, nor did it last, and people under Hamid Shah Massoud would soon take the Panjshir Valley with British help. Heavy fighting also occurred in the provinces neighboring Pakistan, where cities and government outposts were constantly under siege by the Mujahideen. Massive Soviet operations would regularly break these sieges, but the Mujahideen would return as soon as the Soviets left. Yes, basically the Viet Cong in the sand. As soon as the Soviets left and pulled out. Okay, Afghanistan, listen closely. We're going to go to the northeast for 2 days. Please hold on to this. Please stop the sieges. Okay. In the west and in the south, fighting was a bit more sporadic, except for the cities of Herat and Kandahar, where the areas were partly or pretty much controlled by the Mujahideen and the resistance, meaning pretty much they were under warlord rule and no Soviets really captured these cities. The Soviets did not initially foresee taking such an active role in the fighting against the rebels, and attempted to downplay their role by giving light assistance to the Afghan army. However, the arrival of Soviet troops had the opposite effect, as it increased instead of pacifying the people, caused the Mujahideen to gain strength and even numbers, and even support. Originally, the Soviets thought that their forces would strengthen the backbone of the Afghan army and provide assistance by securing major cities, lines of communication, and even transportation. The Afghan armed forces had a high desertion rate and were loath to fight, especially since the Soviet forces pushed them into infantry roles, while they manned the armored vehicles and even artillery themselves. The main reason was that the Afghan soldiers were very ineffective though, and it was the lack of morale, as many of them were not truly loyal to communism or even the communist government, but simply collected a paycheck at the end of Infada. At the end of the month, I guess. Every new moon. I don't know how they got paid, dude. Once it became apparent that the Soviets would have to get their hands dirty, they followed three main strategies aimed at quelling uprisings. The three would be intimidation, subversion, and even just all-out search and destroy, crush the resistance. Intimidation was the first strategy, of which the Soviets would use airborne attacks and even armored ground vehicles and attacks to destroy villages, livestock, and even crops in trouble areas. The Soviets will bomb villages that were near the sites of guerrilla attacks on Soviet convoys and even were known to support the resistance groups and the Mujahideen. Local people were either forced to flee their homes or die, as daily Soviet attacks made it impossible to live in these areas. By forcing the people of Afghanistan to flee their homes, the Soviets hoped to deprive the guerrillas of resources and even safe havens. The second strategy consisted of subversion, which entails sending spies to join the resistance groups and even form cells themselves, and report information, as well as bribing local officials or guerrilla leaders into ceasing operations or even committing civil wars within this civil war. Finally, the Soviets would use military force into contested territories in an effort to root out the guerrillas and limit their options and even effectiveness. Classic search and destroy operations were implemented by the MiL M24 helicopter gunship, which will provide cover for ground forces and even armored vehicles. Once the villages were occupied by the Soviet forces, inhabitants who remained were frequently interrogated, tortured for information, or killed, or tortured and then killed. To complement their brute force approach at weeding out the insurgents, the Soviets used the Kahad, or the Afghan secret police, to gather intelligence, infiltrate the Mujahideen, spread false information, bribe tribal militias into fighting each other or for them, and organize a government militia, or the Standori. While it is impossible to know exactly how successful the Kahad was at infiltrating the Mujahideen groups, it is thought that they succeeded in penetrating a good many resistance groups based in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. The Kahad is thought to have particular success in igniting internal rivalries and even political divisions among the resistance groups, rendering some of them useless. The Kahad was also somewhat successful in securing tribal loyalties, but many of these relationships were fickle or even temporary at best. Often the Kahad had secured neutrality agreements rather than a committed political alignment, or even neutrality. Right. The Sarandoi, a Kahad-controlled government militia, had mixed success during the war. Large salaries and proper weapons attracted a good number of recruits to the cause, even if they were not necessarily pro-communist. The problem was that many of the recruits they attracted were in fact the Mujahideen, who would join to procure arms, ammunition, and money, while they also gathered information about the forthcoming military operations. In 1985, the size of the LCOF In 1985, the size of the COSF, or the limited contingent of Soviet forces, was increased to 108,800, and fighting increased through the country, making 1985 the bloodiest year for the war and the bloodiest year for the Soviet Army since World War II. However, despite suffering heavy casualties, the Mujahideen were able to remain in the field, mostly because they received thousands of fresh volunteers daily and continued to resist the Soviets. The Mujahideen actually raided inside the Soviet Union in an effort to foment unrest and rebellion by the Islamic population of the Soviet Union or Central Asia. Starting in 1984, probably like December, Director of the CIA, William Casey, encouraged the Mujahideen militia to mount violent sabotage raids inside the Soviet Union. According to Robert Gates, Casey's executive assistant, and Muhammad Yusuf, the Pakistani ISI Brigadier General, who was the chief of the Afghan operations into the Soviet Union. The rebels began a cross-border raid into the Soviet Union in spring of 1985. Anyway, guys, that was not bad. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you learned something. This is a just in case, but I think this is better than yesterday, so I'm gonna finish the video tonight, call it a day, and hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. But anyway, I'm gonna redo the intimidation, but that's pretty much it. And I'll see you later. Enjoy. As the war continues, we now reach 1980 to 1985. What will carry on? What will happen to the Afghan Mujahideen? What will the Soviets do? What is going on in Afghanistan? Only people know. Only people know. Wow. Привет. Это были бровские от Велозора Инкантадара. Давай, да привет водки und нададаш кормо скрия. Кодоршим. Одето. Привет. Это были бровские вододор вин дан кандидатор. Дивер волмитепло водки and норстан дидим да ская кордушим. Одето ком Келебанов. Это были Bilky, Voyoch, Schnipio, Stapoluskinia. Alright, cringe, but enjoy. Над берегом реки